Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Harav, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we're continuing here in the tour. Hey, it says there like this: Matza shenefet ad she'im porsin ota en chutim nimshachim. Yeah, this one we did already. 1 second, one more. Okay, so I think we have to catch up on the tour a little bit. I have to read some extra stuff here. So Katav, it says like this: Katav bal halachot gedolot. Says this rabbi. If afia al gav karka or al tafka nafik by dechobate. So again, right, that's what we talked about yesterday, that he baked it on the ground. He does full obligation like that. So it says, and if you need to fry the dough in a pan with oil, it's allowed. So how do you do that? How do you fry the matzah? So he says first you should heat up the oil, right? Make sure it's nice and hot, nice and boiling. Ba'esh with fire. Sheitlaben b'shalhevet yafeh. So that means, right, that the flame is going to get it nice and hot. And then, right, once the oil is already hot, boiling, right, you put the dough inside there, and you can fry it like that. Beshemen with oil, mutar, you're allowed to do that. The fish en la panai lechamitz, because right, it doesn't have any time to leaven in a scenario like that. So therefore, there's no issue. There's no issue there of leavening. Right. By the way, what we did not say is that you can fulfill your obligation with the mitzvah by with the fried matzah. With that, we didn't say. What we're saying is that you're allowed to eat that on Passover. That's what we're saying. Because as we said right before, that you can only fulfill your obligation of the mitzvah with the matzah that was baked, and not fried or cooked in cooked in water. Right, boiled in water. That's not the way to do it. So yeah, the same thing applies here apparently. So let's see. Right, let's go on a little bit further. But he said, what about if you did it the other way around? Right. Let's say you first put the dough, and then you heated up the oil. Right. Asur. So that's going to be forbidden. Ve'achi shadar rav. Kohen Tzedek Resh Metivta. So he said that's the way this rabbi sent a like some kind of correspondence, right? That it's forbidden. אבל לחלות העיסה ברותחין קודם אפייה אסור. But he says, if you want to boil, right, the dough before baking it, that's forbidden, right? We already talked about this before, by the way, that you should not do that. You should not boil the dough before you bake it because it could become leavened by the boiling process. So this rabbi says, right, that Rav Shera, that even though in general, like we say that, when you do chalita, which means that, it's like a boiling thing, you're boiling the matzah before you bake it. So the truth is, the way they knew how to do it in those days, it did not leaven. The problem is we don't know how to do it. This is the problem. But anyway, right, in those days, they knew how to do it, so they did it. Nowadays, it's forbidden. Anyway, so it goes on to say, so he says, what does that mean, chalita? That means you're boiling it in water. Al gav kemach, right? Lo shamanu bechol yeshivot sheitiru zeh. So he says that nowadays we don't allow that in the yeshivot, whatever, right? Ela lechaya or lechole. So the only thing we allow, right, to this kind of thing, is if it's for somebody who is sick, right, or somebody who is just gave birth, whatever, like a woman. Alpi, it says alpi bekiin, right, and it has to be done by experts, people who know how to do this process. V'chen katav Rabbeinu Hai. This rabbi also says this, right? Matza chaluta berotchin matzahi. So he says that when you boil the matzah like this, it's still called matzah. Aval Rabbanan kameh amre lo yadinan chalita echi hava. But he says the rabbis already mentioned, or the earlier rabbis, right, that we shouldn't do this because we don't know how to do it properly. So since we don't have the technique properly, there's a chance that it's going to become leavened. There's a danger of that. So therefore, we avoid it. וכמה חולים טרחו להתיר להם, חולים טרחו להתיר להם משעורים בחליטה ולא התירו הגאונים. So he says that even right the Geonim, he says we're not allowing this even for sick people. Okay, this was some kind of like a medicine that they used to take in those days, which was made by boiling barley, whatever. So they only allowed it for sick people, as we said. So, and that's only if the illness is somewhat extreme, right, severe. So then the rabbis did allow it, but otherwise not so. Let's go on. It says matzah shenefet im chametz betanur. So right, this is now what we're doing in currently. So we just caught up right now. We just did some catch up in the tour, right? Things that we didn't get yesterday. So now we're doing the current topic, which is that if you have matzah and you baked it with bread with chametz in the oven. So what does that mean? You baked both of them at the same time, right? Matzah and chametz concurrently, at the same time. So the question is, that matzah, right? Is it forbidden, or can you have that? Right. So what's the answer? Katav Rabbeinu Tam shemutar. Right. So Rabbeinu Tam says you're allowed to have that. Dereach ki lo matzino sheyasor kol apat. So he says because there's a rule like this, right? That the vapors that come out of the bread do not forbid the matzah, right? The vapors don't have the power to make it leaven or whatever, or to give it the taste of leaven or anything like that. So vapors don't do the job, basically, right? Of forbidding something. So therefore, right, this is the reason why we allow it, according to Rabbeinu Tam. So then he goes on. V'yesh osim, and he says some forbid that. No, it's a machloket. Everything's machloket, right? And this is also machloket. Im naga zeh bazeh, right? Some say, right, if they touched each other. Oh, so if they touched each other, then they say it's forbidden. But as long as there was no physical contact, it's just the vapors, like right, got mixed in there, one with the other. This we're not worried about. So what do you see from there, right? The vapors are kosher. Okay, well, that's what it is. So yeah. ויש עושים אם נגע זה בזה, דדמה לפת חמה וחבית פתוחה. Right, so he says that's similar to like there's something in the Talmud about hot bread and an open barrel, and so what happens is that one, right, touches the other, so therefore it's forbidden. So same thing also over here. That if they touch each other, then it's a problem. But if there's no physical contact, as we said, no problem. ודעת אדוני אבירוסה תשארי אפילו במצה שנמצאת בה חיטה בקועה. So he says, right, he says, according to the Rosh, he says, my father, it's permitted even if you found, right, in a matzah, you found the wheat there, bekwa, which was already cracked, which means that it leavened. It says that's also permitted. Okay, interesting. So that's even a bigger leniency, right? That's what we're saying. What's the leniency? That even though you bake some matzah, and you found in there like a piece of wheat, so you may think, oh, gee whiz, it's forbidden. The whole thing is forbidden, but it's not. So then what are we gonna do? Right? How do we permit that? Obviously, the wheat you can't have because it could be chametz. But what you do is you remove the wheat and you can have the matzah. That's what you do. Okay, good. So let's go on. Yeah, that's the end of it, pretty much. But he says here in the parentheses, I am the sub siman tifnun b'shem go b'midin le'aniach matzot b'kli chametz. Okay, that's a different story. Anyway, right, that's the story. So that's the end of the tour. Okay. So let's go to Bet Yosef. Says Bet Yosef here, right? V'zeh lashon Mordechai, right? This is the language of the Mordechai. The parak called Sha'ah. Right, in this parak, Maaseh ira bepesach shegoy hishlich ugat chametz betanu. Oh, so he says, right, this is a real story that happened. That there was a certain oven they were using on Passover, right? And a goy threw in there a piece of cake, right, which is chametz. He threw it into the oven, right? Melo matzot, right? And what's the story? The story is, right, that the oven was full of matzot. They were baking matzot over there in the oven, and all of a sudden comes this goy, right, and throws in a piece of cake in there. So, what do you do in a case like that? That's the question. So, what's the answer? So it says, "V'horu lahem she'im nagah chametz b'matzah asur." So this is what they answered. Right, exactly what we just said. That if they touched the matzah, so then it's forbidden. But as long as they didn't touch, right, and it just like fell in there somewhere, in the oven, it's okay. Because as we said, right, we're not really worried about the vapors. We're worried about the physical contact. That's what really bothers us. Otherwise, it's okay. There's also like a Magen Avraham I saw, one time he also writes this that if you by mistake, let's say, right, you baked matzot in an oven which wasn't koshered, and not only wasn't koshered, but there was like pieces of chametz in there, Can you imagine, like like let's say, pieces of pizza there, some pizza. There was some pizza, right, the stuff there. right, in the oven, and you baked the matzah together with the pizza. So, what's the rule? So it says in Magen Avraham, you're allowed to have that matzah. It's kosher. You know what I mean? As we said, right? As long as they don't touch, it's okay. Because we're not, again, right? We're not worried about the vapors. Same thing over here, right? Same idea, exactly. There are people, by the way, who think, that the vapors, are going to make it treif, but it's not true. It's not correct. They haven't learned their stuff. They don't know their stuff so good. So anyway, right? Let's go on. So it's similar to what it says in the last parak of Avodah Zarah. Bepat chama vechavit, right? As we said, we're talking about the hot bread with the barrel, right? There's some barrel there with some beer or whatever. Divrei kol asur. Everybody agrees that it's asur there. Why? Because they actually touched, right? Hacha nami asur benegiyah, right? It's also here, same thing, right? If it touches, it's a problem. Aval im lo naga mutar. But if it didn't touch, it's allowed, right? As we said. The kaimalan rechalav miltai, because the halacha is right that it says in Masachet Psachim, right? Samech Vav Amud Bet, that what? That the vapors do not trafe up the food, right? Basically, that's what we're saying, right? By the way, that also applies to something else as well. For instance, let's say you baked in one oven, right? Kosher meat and non-kosher meat, right? Let's say right, there was some pork in there, right? Some pork, ham, right? There was ham, and he baked it together with roast beef, which is glatt kosher, right? So what's the rule? The rule is, right, the beef is kosher, even though it was baked with the ham together in the same oven. Right? Of course, the chatchila, you shouldn't do that, but b'diavad, right? If it was done, the meat is kosher. So you're gonna tell me, wait a second, but what about the vapors? So the answer is the vapors don't really, trafe up to anything, right? They don't have the power to do that. So therefore, right, it's all kosher. Everything is kosher there, except the ham, of course, right? The ham you gotta get rid of it. That's something else, right? We're not talking about that. Okay, so that's the way it goes. Good. The Chen Hashiv Rabbeinu Tam says Al Chametz Matzah Shenefu Yachad. Says also Rabbeinu Tam said the same thing as we already mentioned before, right? Rabbeinu Tam. בתנור אחד, כמה ריחות מצינו בתלמוד, אבל ריח פת איסור בפת היתר לא מצינו. So he says that we don't find, right, that the smell, right, the vapors from the bread can forbid something. וכמה פעמים אנו אופים חלה עם הפת. So he says, we do this like all the time. That what? That we bake, right, challah with bread. ואין מקפידים בפת. He says we're not really, right, we're not really worried about the bread. In other words, what we do is, we do the challah. The challah is forbidden, right? Because, it's only for kohanim. So we're not allowed to have that, if you eat challah, you got a big problem. So, but nevertheless, right, even though you baked in the same oven, the challah with the bread, right, the bread is kosher. Why? Because we're not worried about, the vapors of the challah, right, coming in, right, trafing up the bread. We're not worried about that. Same thing. Okay, good. The old heavy Ravia, right, also brings the Ravia. Raya mi lachmet todah. There's also another source he brings, right, from the bread of the Todah, right, Thanksgiving bread, which is, brought in the temple. Shaya chametz, which was, it was chametz, right, it was leavened. Nafet ima matzah, and it was baked together with matzah. Adkan, right, that's the end of it. V'nireh mikan de'echad de nagu ze bazeh gam Rabbeinu Tam asur. So he says, right, that even Rabbeinu Tam will admit that if they touched each other, it's forbidden, right? That's already something else. He says, even though the Torah doesn't seem to really allude to that, but nevertheless, right, that would be the rule. That even according to Rabbeinu Tam, if they touch each other, it's going to be forbidden. Okay, good. So that's the Bet Yosef. There's more. Then he goes on to say, "Umash katav Rabbeinu sheledat Adoni Avar is the dasher yavilu b'matzah shenimtzet ba hitchita b'kvar." Right. So he says now he brings that right what we saw on the tour that according to the Rosh, even if there was wheat in the matzah, it's still kosher the matzah. So klomar shehu katav. So it says Bet Yosef. He explains what that means, right? That he wrote shafilu hayta ota chita chametz. That even if that wheat was chametz, right, as we said. And it's together with the matzah. Lama tiasor kol matzah, right? Afia lo have kibishul. So he says it doesn't. It's not going to forbid the whole matzah, just because there was a piece of wheat in there. So why is that? But here, right? The thing is that it's more of a chidush right here. It's more of a novel idea. Why? Because here they're touching actually, and still we're saying that it's allowed. Because before we said, right, if they're touching, it's forbidden. But here the Rosh is saying that even if they're touching, is permitted. So the question is, why is that, right? How can it be permitted if they're touching? So explains the Rosh, the reason why it's permitted, he says, is because that the afia lo have kebishul leitpashet tam bekol hadcharacha. So he says, you know what it is? When you're baking, right? You're baking, in a dry situation, right? There's no liquid there. So it's not the same thing as cooking, something, right? Cooking is a different story. Why is that? Because when you cook something, right, two things together in one pot with the water, right? So then what happens is that the taste spreads all over the pot because of the water. But here, since we're baking in the oven, right, there's no water there. So therefore, says the Rosh, right, the taste of that wheat is not gonna spread all over the matzah. It's it's not that strong, right? Because there's no liquid there. That's the reason why. Okay, good. This is very important stuff here, right? You guys have to listen carefully because this is like very important rules about kashrut. Okay. Right. So it says in the baking process, right, the taste of the wheat will not spread throughout the matzah because it's only dry contact. So therefore he says, so then how much is it forbidden, right? In other words, that place where it's touching, right? The wheat is touching the matzah. How much of the matzah has to be removed from there? Because it's forbidden, right? How much? So it says kedek klipa, right? What does that mean, kedek klipa? That means like you have to take off like a klipa is like how do you call this, right? Like yeah.
Impurity, could that be klipa?
I'm sorry?
Impurity, could that be?
No, klipa is not impurity. Klipa means no, you're talking about the Kabbalah, right? That's something else. Oh, yeah. You're getting into Kabbalah over here.
Sounds similar,
Okay.
I guess the impurity falls.
Okay, very nice. Okay, very good. Okay. Don't get me into trouble now with Kabbalah. Okay, so anyway, right? Here, right, the klipa is not what you're talking about. The word klipa simply means in Hebrew, it means like a shell, right? A shell, a husk, right? Something which like covers, the fruit, right? The skin of the fruit is called klipa. Any shell of any food is called klipa. So same thing over here, So you got to remove like the thickness of a shell. That's what it means, and then the rest of it will be kosher because the taste of the wheat will not spread further than that. That's what he's saying, right? Okay. Okay, netila, right? Or netila, right? Netila is a little bit thicker, like it's like the thickness of one finger, so it's even thicker than the klipa. So either way, right? Whether it's a klipa, which is like just like a little shell, little husk there, right? Whatever, little right skin. Right. What I call it? There's a scientific word, epidermis. Like something. Okay, whatever you want to call it, right? Anyway, right. So, או כדי נטילה, right? כמו כתוב בסימן תס"ז, right? Like it says over there in the siman, in the chapter. יראה דהכה נמי שרי, כלומר, it says here also, it seems like it's permitted, right? כלומר, על ידי קליפה. So what does that mean? Once you remove, right, that shell, right, the thickness of a shell from the matzah, so then the rest of the matzah will be allowed, right? Or, a natila, right, which is thicker, as we said, like a finger, So either way, right, the whole matzah will not be forbidden, right? Only just one, right, one layer, right, of matzah will have to be removed. What does that mean? The layer that surrounds the wheat, right? That's what we're talking about. I hope you guys are following me. Okay, so ויש לדקדק בדברי רבנו, למה כתב יראה שתאחד נם משרת דין זה היינו ממש מה שכתב בראש. So he asked a question over here, the Bet Yosef, right? Why is it that Rabbeinu here writes that it seems like it's allowed? What does that mean, seems like? In other words, the Rosh said it's allowed, So what does that mean, seems like? Like as if like he's not sure. So why is he not sure if the Rosh allowed it? That's the question. So what's the answer? So he says, מה שכתב הראש גבי חיטה בקועה שנמצאת במצה, ואדרבה, היא עדיפה, so he says that's even better, that case, שמתיר המצה עצמה, allows the matzah itself, וכך הווה לממר, so therefore the Torah should have said like this, לדת אדוני אבו ירוסה, he says, you should have said like this, according to my father's opinion, תשארי אפילו במצה שנמצאת בחיטה, it's even allowed, right, to have that matzah, which was mixed together with wheat, which was chametz. Can you imagine we go that far? Go tell somebody today, right? You're allowed to eat that. They'll kill you, right? They'll strangle you, right? They're gonna think you're crazy. So שנמצאת במחיטה וקועה, ואחא נמי השערי. ונראה לי משום דהראש כתב שם, אפילו נדבקה, אינו חמץ כאמור, אלא קרוב להחמיץ. So he says, it could be that the reason why the two wrote that way, that it's not really for sure, is because the Rosh himself also wrote something like similar to that. What did he say? He says, right, that it's not real chametz, it's just like close to being chametz. Right? Hava efshar. So in other words, that piece of wheat that was there was not true chametz, it was close to getting chametz. So it says karov lechachamitz hava efshar lemimar. So it's possible to say, it could have been possible to say, shemash katav sheafilu hayta chametz lama teaser kol hamatzah haynu mishum debechita bekuah mayre. So it says it could be the reason why the Rosh was so lenient is because it wasn't real chametz, it was like close to being chametz. She'ena chametz gamur, aval bechametz gamur. But it says if it was real chametz, that's already something else. Can you don't do that? Like this is our discussion. Dilma, right? Piece of pizza, right? The pizza is chametz. You know what I mean? It's not doubtful, right? Pizza is real chametz. So that's a different story altogether, right? Dilma le'arosh nami asur. So then, right, even according to Rosh, could be that's forbidden. If it's real chametz. That's the reason why the Torah said, right? It seems like it's halal. You know what I mean? In other words, not for sure. So he says, that it's allowed, that from his words you see that it implies that even with real chametz, right, it's allowed. Okay. Good. So it goes on with Yosef. Katav Mordechai, right? It says Mordechai, Pek Elu Overin over there. Ve'agaot Maimon Bepek K. Also, this rabbi, Beshem Rokach, right? The name of this rabbi. Tzarich lizayer leachar she'ofina matzot. So he says like this, right? That you have to be careful after you bake the matzot. Shelo itanum b'mapa. Oh, so he says don't put them inside a tablecloth. Or bikli, or in some kind of a utensil. Sheesh bo kemach. So what are we talking about? that there's flour in there, right? In that utensil. That's the reason why we have a problem. Shimei da bikakemach b'matzah. So why is that? Because since it could be that the hot matzah, right, the flour will stick to it when you put it in there. And then he's going to soak the matzah right inside soup, right? Ima kemach with the flour. Shalia, which is on it, it's going to leaven, right? So this is the reason why you should be careful, right, not to do that. So again, right, what did we just say? What we just said was that after you bake the matzah, right, don't place it in a utensil which has what do you call it, flour in there, as we said, right? That's the reason why. Okay, let's go on. כתב את תרומת הדשן, right? This rabbi says, מצה שנכפלה בתנור באפייתה, אם הוא בתוך הפסח עשינן. Oh, interesting, right? So he says, right, that this happens, by the way, sometimes. I've seen this, I've seen this before. That sometimes what happens is that when you bake the matzah in the oven, right, it folds up, and it becomes like a double layer matzah, right? So is there any problem with that, or is that okay? So says the Trumat Hadeshen, there's a problem with this, right? If you baked it on Passover, right, this kind of a matzah, so he says we forbid all of them, even though they're not stuck together. Ela kol shehu, even a little bit, if they're touching a little bit, the chametz bepesach b'mashu, because the prohibition of chametz on Passover is even with a little bit, right? Even a little amount. So yeah, so interesting, right? So he says, right, that any matzah which touched that matzah, which got doubled over, right, got folded over, is going to be forbidden, he says. If you baked it on Passover itself. Why is that? Because the rule changes on Passover, right? That there's no nullification, right? Even with a 60th, right? Even with 1,000, doesn't get nullified. So therefore, right, we're afraid that if that double matzah, right, that folded matzah, touched another matzah, so we're afraid, right, that matzah is also forbidden. So therefore, anything that it touches, this folded matzah, is going to be forbidden. All the more so itself, right, which is not going to be allowed. So, by the way, why are we worried when the matzah gets folded? What's the problem? Anybody know? Okay, I'll help you if you.
That it's not going to get baked, perhaps?
Exactly. That's the thing. When it gets folded over, right, that surface area inside there, is not baked well. The fire doesn't reach it, So therefore, right, we're concerned that it's going to leaven there. Very good. Okay, so you guys are on the ball. Okay, very nice. So yeah, that's the story. And not only that, he says, right, even something which touched it is also going to be forbidden. That's already, quite a big big stretch, but that's the way it is, according to this rabbi. Okay, anyway, he says that's one of the big rabbis, one of the big rabbis. He was stringent like that, like what we just said. Okay. ונראה דטעמו היה משום דחיישינן שמא לא היה החום האש יכול לשלוט בין הדבקות בכוח להפות ביד האחי נתחמצה בתנור. So right, what he just said right now, Beit Yosef, is exactly what you said, right? Your definition of what the problem is here. Right, so you're on the right track there. So אך בערב פסח אם הדבקות כל כך מועט שיש במצה כולה 60 כנגד המקום לדבק. But it says, if you baked it on the eve of Passover, right, before Passover, that's right, there's something different, right? So it says, then if you have like a 60th, in that matzah, to nullify that folded area, so then it would be allowed, right? It will get nullified. So what's the difference, right? The difference is simple, right? That before Passover, it can get nullified if you bake it before Passover. If you bake it on Passover itself, it cannot get nullified. So therefore, it's all forbidden. That's the story. Okay, good. Very nice. So it says, כולם 60 כנגד מקום הדבק, פורסין מקום הדבק, ושאר המצה מותר. So then what do we do, right? Practically speaking, if there is a 60th, what we do is we remove the folded part, right? We discard that, and the rest of it we can eat. That's what we do. That's only if it was baked before Passover, as we said, right? The shara matzah mutar, right? And the rest of the matzah is going to be allowed. So you got to be careful, right? That because of this, what we just mentioned, you got to be careful that your matzah should never get folded over, right? This happens, by the way, sometimes. For some reason, the matzah, right, because of the heat or whatever in the oven, it folds. And you get a folded matzah coming out of the oven, right? So that's going to be a problem, right? You have to follow these rules we just mentioned. Okay, good. So the chametz בערב פסח ב-60. עד כאן השנה. That's the end of it. Okay. ומה שכתב, אם הוא בתוך הפסח עשרינן לכל המצות כולם. And so now Bit Yosef comes and comments on this, right? That which he wrote, that if he baked it on Passover itself, then we forbid the whole batch, whatever touched it, right? If it touched it. So he says, לאותה מצה, נראה דהיינו לומר דעשר לאותה מצה כולה. So he says, what it really means is that he forbade that matzah, the whole matzah, right? Only that piece, only that loaf. The ilu l'shar matzah basis, when it comes to the other matzot, and tam b'davar, there's no reason to forbid those, right? Because they don't touch them. So meaning what, right? These are separate loaves, and they're not really touching each other. So there's no reason to forbid the other loaves in the oven, right? Only the one which got folded over. Because they didn't touch. Usually they don't touch. Okay. And also it says we already said, right, that we already mentioned that according to the Rosh, right, that even if there was, the matzah got baked with chametz itself, it was touching, the wheat, and we still said it's allowed, right? You can just remove the surrounding area, right? The surrounding shell, right? Whatever, right? And the rest of it is allowed. So all the more so over here, that's what he's trying to say, right? The shara echad delog nagav kol sheken, if it didn't touch, right? All the more so, he says hacha here shen chimutz ze barur, because it says here, right? This leavening is not really so clear. In other words, it's not so clear that it leavened. That even though it got folded, right? It's not 100% clear that it's got leavened. It's possible that it got leavened. That's what it is. Possibility. It says, therefore, we never saw anybody who was, really concerned about that. So he says, the truth is, he says, look what he's saying, right? That it's only this rabbi, who's stringent about that. But, he says, the truth is, we never heard any other rabbis who were stringent regarding this. So what does that mean? The other rabbis, as we said, right, they hold that, he just removed, right, the bad part and the surrounding area, right? And the rest of the matzah is allowed. So the only rabbi who forbids this is this rabbi, right? But all the other rabbis don't forbid. So, he says, right, it's like a minority opinion, right? Single opinion against everybody else. Okay. Good. So it says, so therefore he says, according to the other opinion that we saw, right, which was the Rosh who allows, the only thing you've got to do is just remove the folded part, right, and the rest of it is going to be allowed. Okay. That's what it says, like the Rosh, as we said. בחיטה שנמצאת במצה, right? Regarding the wheat which was found in the matzah, which was baked afuyah, וכמו שנתבהר בסימן תס"ז, which was explained in this chapter. Okay, ready to go. So we'll just do a Shulchan Aruch, and I think we're done with the whole chapter here. So we'll stop there. Beautiful, right? Coming along very nicely here. God bless, beautiful. All right, so it says in Shulchan Aruch like this: Im afu chametz, right? Im matzah. If they bake together, right, in one oven, chametz and matzah together, right, in one oven. Lo ne'asar ela im ken naga bechametz. So it says Shulchan Aruch, right? It's only forbidden if it touched. But if it didn't touch, right, it's not forbidden. It's allowed. As we said, right? What's the reason why? Because the vapors don't forbid it, right? The vapors don't have the power to forbid anything. So it says if it did touch, right? What do you do? Right? Or let's say, right, it was one piece, the wheat and matzah in one piece. So you have to remove, right, the surrounding area. How much? One finger, right? Which is 2 centimeters. So you got to remove 2 centimeters surrounding that chametz, right, area. And the rest of the matzah is allowed, even though it's the same loaf, right? Yeah. Okay, good, right? Hope you're following me. So says the Ramah regarding this, matzah shenitkapelah betanur bedvuka. So he brings this case of the matzah which got folded, right? Our folding matzah story, right? The folding matzah case. So what happens over there, right? It says Ramah, ad she'en sholet sham esh, right? So the problem is, right, that as we said, that place which gets folded over, the fire doesn't get well into there, so we're concerned that it's not going to get baked properly. So says Ramah, right, that we forbid that. The whole matzah, right? But as we said, right, the Bet Yosef didn't agree with this. He said that there's no reason to forbid, right? Just take the surrounding area and the rest of it should be allowed. So the Ramah here is stringent, against the Rosh, by the way, which is surprising. But Maran, right, the Bet Yosef here paskins like the Rosh. Right? So therefore, right, it's a dispute over here between the Ramah and the Maran. According to Maran, as we said, right, this case is allowed as long as you remove the surrounding area. Right? The rest of the matzah is going to be allowed. That's all. That's if you baked it on Passover, right? During Passover. But he says the Ramah, even the Ramah agrees, right? That before Passover, there's no reason to forbid. Because it gets nullified, right? Okay. Makom devuka. Good. So it says, rak makom devuka. So it says, therefore, right, if you baked it before Passover, even according to a stringent opinion, right, you're only gonna forbid the place where it touched, right, something it touched, but otherwise, right, no. Something it didn't touch, no. So this is Trumat Hadeshen, right? So Trumat Hadeshen was stringent, and but we, like the Sfardim, we go like the Rosh, who was lenient about this, as we just mentioned. Okay. Then it goes on the Ramah here, Matzah nefucha be'emtzaita, right? So there's another, right, scenario, which is, right, that in the middle of the matzah, you have like it's like it got inflated, like it got blown up. This happens, by the way, sometimes when you have like a bakery going, right? Some of the matzahs come out to be like inflated. Like it blows up, like there's like a piece of air inside there. So the question is, right, what's the status? Is that chametz there in that inflated part? What do we say about that, right? That's the question. So Vem said that Asura. So it says Ramah writes that it's forbidden. אבל אם עלה עליה קרום כדרך שעולה על הפת בשעת אפייה מותרת. But it says the Ramah, this is interesting, right? He says, but if that blown up part, right, has like it's got a crust around it, right, then it's okay. If it formed a crust, right, that proves that it's not chametz there. But if it did not form a crust, it stayed like, soft, whatever, moist, whatever, right? Then that shows that it's chametz there. Could be chametz. So therefore we forbid it. That's what the Ramah says. Okay. Good. ואם שני מצות שוכבות זו על זו בתנור קודם אפייתן אסורים דהרי כמצה כפולה. So it says Ramah another thing, right? What about if you have one matzah which is lying on top of the other, and they baked it like that, right? They baked it like two layers, one on top of the other. So he says it's the same thing as like a folded matzah, right? So the same rule that we apply for a folded matzah also applies to this, which is like one on top of the other, Double decker. It's like a double decker matzah. Okay. So so says Ramah furthermore, should be careful. Right? Says, be careful, because of all these things we just mentioned, right? One should be careful that two different matzot, right, should not touch each other in the oven, right? When they're still, moist, right? When they're still like a dough, because it's going to be a problem, right? As we said, when they're touching. What's the reason why it's a problem when they're touching? Because the fire can't get in there, right? That place, that area which is covered, the fire can't get in there to bake it well. So it's the same problem. So therefore can come to leaven. Okay, so basically, right, what do we see over here? That, right, to sum it up, right, summation, right, that the Ramah is a little bit more stringent here, right, according to Tumat Hadeshen. So what's the difference, right? According to the Shulchan Aruch, according to Bet Yosef, if you have like a folded matzah, right, or something similar to that, right, and there's concern, that there's chametz there. So what you got to do is, right, remove the surrounding area, and the rest of the matzah is permitted. How much of the surrounding area? As we said, right, 1 finger, 2 centimeters. That's the story. And the Ramah is stringent, right? So what does that mean? According to Ramah, the whole matzah is forbidden, right? In a case like that. When do we say that? If you baked it before Passover, right? But if you baked it during I'm sorry, just the opposite, right? When you baked it on Passover, which is forbidden because it doesn't get nullified. But if you baked it before Passover, it does get nullified. So even the Ramah admits, right, that if it's before Passover and right, it got folded or whatever. So what you do is you just remove that part with the folded part, and the rest of it is allowed. Why is that? Because it got nullified, right? In 60th. If there's enough to have 60th there, it has to be enough for a 60th. So then it's going to be permitted. Right? But according to Shulchan Aruch, you don't need this. According to Bet Yosef, what's the reason why you don't need it? According to the Rosh, right? Because as we said, right, that since it's only dry contact in the oven, right, there's no liquid there, so therefore that it doesn't spread, the chametz doesn't spread more than one finger, right? One, right? That's it. That's all spreads because there's no liquid, so it doesn't spread much. So therefore, right, that's it's allowed. It's going to be allowed like that. Okay, very good. So we're done with this chapter. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. And B'ezrat Hashem, Baruch Hashem, we're getting ready for Passover. I hope we're already ready for Purim, right? So we know all the halachot already, right? Everything. It's like the back of our hand. We know everything already. So B'ezrat Hashem, if you have any questions about Purim or Passover, let me know. I'll be here for you to help you. B'ezrat Hashem. And we'll see you tomorrow. Chazak Baruch, Laila Tov.
Kavod Tara, thank you so much.
All the best.